Last week we started this series about something that we called the whole thanks, which is really just a way of saying that I think that sometimes we talk about things like Thanksgiving and having a spirit of thanks for God, and then we don't ever actually unpack really what that means or what that implies. Last week we talked about how we can be thankful about the fact that God is sovereign, that He has dominion over all things, and because He has dominion, it means that there are so many things that we don't have to put on our own shoulders. We are free to be able to just live in a way that God is calling us to live, to just listen for what He's calling for us to do, rather than worrying about all of the world's problems, past, present, and future, and trying to act in such a way as if somehow what we're going to do is going to change the course of all time. Today, I want to look at a different aspect of being thankful to our God. So, we should be thankful for His dominion, but we should also obviously be immensely thankful for God's unyielding compassion, His boundless compassion that He has. If there's one thing that many people don't need to be convinced of, it's that Christ is personified in many ways by His compassion that He felt for so many individuals. Now, as Christians, sometimes we're all about the rhetoric of compassion, but when it comes to actually showing compassion for someone, that's where things start going a little bit sideways. You see, there might be certain individuals that we assume are maybe more deserving of compassion than others. Maybe that's based on their background. Maybe it's based on actions that they perform that we view as making them unworthy. Maybe it's because we think that they will squander the compassion that we give them. But when we look at Christ did not hold back His compassion from anyone. In fact, despite the fact that you see Christ commissioning the 12 disciples saying, do not go to the Gentiles or anyone in Samaria, you see a Gentile, an individual who is a Roman centurion, approach Christ. And this individual pleads with Christ, I have this servant in my house who is sick, and I know if you'll just say the word that you can heal this individual. And Christ doesn't just simply do what the individual says. He actually is astonished, it says, and says that there's no individual that has a stronger faith than this individual, this Gentile centurion. There's this significance in this that you could just look at the faith of the centurion and kind of say, wow, that's amazing, but instead I want you to look at the fact that this was an individual that most of Jewish society would have looked at as an invader, an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their society. If there was anybody who didn't deserve compassion, it would be this individual, and yet Christ showed it anyway. And it just goes to show you that there is no bound that Christ puts over His compassion for others. And if Christ doesn't put bounds on the compassion He shows for others, then who do we think we are that we think we can manufacture our own boundaries beyond which we feel justified in not showing compassion? Now, as you continue moving forward in the Bible, you see many other examples of Christ's compassion. Once again, this is not something that I should be having to convince you of necessarily. I mean, surely we all know that Christ has compassion, but again, let's look at the totality of Christ's compassion. Well, we just got done establishing that there's no boundary beyond which Christ says, okay, beyond this, you don't really have to show compassion. Well, what about the situations of the individuals? Because I think that's where a lot of us will probably erect different walls or put different obstacles in place between our compassion and the compassion of others. Well, one of the things you absolutely see is Christ's compassion over the sick. There's a story of an individual that was a woman that says had some form of hemorrhaging or internal bleeding, and this woman just approached Christ in a crowd and touched His cloak, and in that moment she was healed. And it even has this interaction where Christ has the individual who touched Him revealed and says, your faith has saved you. Now, it's amazing, this little interaction, because this woman, since she was bleeding, would have been considered unclean. You see, her sickness itself would have been something that would have been detestable to individuals of the day, where they wouldn't have wanted to go near them. And I can't tell you how many times I have interacted with different individuals who, may say that I want to be compassionate, I want to love other people, Christ is love, and we should be loved. But yet, when they come into contact with an individual that maybe is in need of some of that compassion, they have aversions. There is something, especially if you've ever done any kind of mission work, like urban missions or anything like that, I've heard it phrased before that, like, there's a smell to poverty. And I don't mean that in like a prejudicial way or anything, but there's like a certain, I don't know how to describe it, like a hygiene or something, especially when you go to third world countries, where it's just kind of the smell of, not having the resources for sanitation and all that kind of stuff. And it's something that can cast a huge aversion, where people can say, oh, I want to be compassionate, but maybe, nobody would say it this way, but only if it looks good on Instagram. And I think if we search our hearts, we probably all have examples where there was somebody that we could have showed compassion to, but maybe it just seemed a little bit too unpalatable to us. One of the other things that we see Christ having compassion towards are individuals who are lost. I think about the feeding of the 5,000. The reason why I love this story is because you had these individuals that Christ even says out loud that, they were like lost sheep, that he had compassion on these individuals. And because of that, he wanted to feed them. He had compassion on these people that were following him. They hadn't necessarily done anything to deserve it. They were just individuals that they were just looking for a path. They were looking for some future. And I think a lot of times when we look at people living their lives, we look at people who are saying different things, doing different things, especially when they're doing those things just trying to like make it by, we'll tend to look at those as, their actions in terms of like, what if we did those things, and say it'd be wrong for me to do it, so that person's doing a bad thing, and then once again, we kind of use that as an example to say like, okay, well, maybe I don't need to have so much compassion because they did a bad thing, or they're living a bad way, or something like that. In reality, when we look at these individuals who are trying to live their life, especially people where it seems like they're searching for something, we should look at those individuals with compassion. Even if they're doing things that maybe they shouldn't be doing, we should still treat them with compassion, because we too were once lost. Our compassion for these individuals should be to introduce them to a better way, to introduce them to a Christ that loves them despite their flaws, so that maybe they too can start reflecting the nature, the virtue, the glory of Christ in their own lives. That is one of those areas where I think a lot of us, once again, kind of really, really struggle with, because, it's always easier to be nice to somebody who's kind of generally nice to you and nice to the people around them, right? But what happens when you're interacting with somebody who is a little bit more prickly? Sometimes it's a lot harder to show those people compassion, and I think that's one of the things I like about this story, because I'm sure in those 5,000 people, there were some individuals that were probably fantastic followers of Christ. There are probably some individuals who were terrible followers of Christ. Just statistically speaking, 5,000 people, some of them were probably jerks, but yet Christ had compassion on them because they were lost. And I feel like that is the bumper sticker we should take away. One of the last things in here that I want to point out is how Christ has compassion on individuals who are fundamentally broken on a spiritual level. And this is something that you end up seeing in Christ when he approaches the city of Jerusalem towards the end of his earthly ministry. When he approaches Jerusalem and he looks, he weeps, and he weeps for the city, and he's weeping because these individuals are going to do the wrong thing. They're going to, and they have been, persecuting God's prophets and putting them to death, and they're going to put Christ to death. It's these individuals that just through their own stubbornness or through the grips that sin has on them, that they just simply do not see that there is a better way. And once again, how often do we see other individuals, especially maybe other Christians, maybe even the most vocal, stalwart, righteous Christians, act like they don't need to love somebody because sin has its grips on them? Christ has compassion on people. Yes, he absolutely stands up for truth. Yes, he absolutely is uncompromising when it comes to what is righteous and what is unrighteous. He is absolutely about being the same as he always has been, as he is, and as he always will be in the future. All those things are absolutely true. But the glory of Christ is that he is able to be all those things, fully just, fully righteous, and at the same time be fully compassionate. And that is a balance that is so hard for us to live out in our own lives, but yet that is the challenge, to be compassionate as Christ is compassionate. So we've just asserted that Christ's compassion is boundless. We've asserted that Christ's compassion is really complete, right? You know, when we talked about Christ's compassion of the sick, the lost, the broken. So what else is there to really talk about to get the full scope of Christ's compassion? And I guess I would talk about the magnitude of his compassion. And what do I mean by magnitude? Well, just as equal as we react to negative situations around us, we must have hearts that are driven towards acting compassionate with the same amount of zeal and fervor. When you look at the final moments of Christ's life before he died and went to hell and then rose again, what you end up seeing is a Christ who is hanging on a cross and does two amazing things. The first thing that he does is he calls out to the Father saying, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." Think about the compassion that takes, that these are individuals who have rejected him, who are mocking him, who are beating him, who are crucifying him and going to persecute his friends. This Christ, who knows these individuals are doing all those things, still calls out to the Father to forgive all of these, what we would call enemies. That is an amazing amount of zeal and fervor being applied to compassion for other individuals, to cry out to his Father to forgive them. And the second act of compassion that we end up seeing is what we see with the two thieves, how there is a thief that is beside Christ. And this thief, to date, we have no inclination that this thief ever did anything to follow Christ. We don't know, he may not have ever sat with Christ or listened to anything he had to say. This individual only really had a knowledge of who Christ was, hanging on the cross as they're both dying, and yet calls out to this Christ and says, "Remember me when you enter into paradise." I can tell you for a fact that I've interacted with so many Christians who will denounce the idea of what they call like jailhouse conversions, or deathbed conversions, people who are in these situations where they don't have any other option, and so they cry out to God. And then, you'll have a certain breed of Christian who will look at that and then almost sneer and just say like, that's just somebody who's just calling out because they're desperate. That's not somebody who has a real faith. As if there's anything any of us have done to actually deserve this idea of grace and this relationship with Christ. But yet what we see in the acts of Christ is that he forgave that thief. He told that thief, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Think about that kind of mind-blowing compassion, an individual who does not deserve anything, that there's no indication that they did anything to make them worthy of the love and the grace and the acceptance of our Savior, and yet he offers it anyway. That is an extreme level of compassion. Something that would almost, if we did it, you would see it as reckless in a sense. Some people might even call you weak, saying that these individuals are taking you for granted. But yet, Christ sees what it truly is, which is an opportunity for his glory to be magnified. Because the love and the compassion of our God can overcome any obstacle of man, any cultural or physical aversion that we may have. That our God's compassion can even overcome sin and death itself, so that he can reside with us at a new and more intimate level for all of eternity. That is an extreme level of compassion, and that is something that we should never take for granted, and we should never stop being thankful for. That's our lesson that I have for you today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.